Egypt, December 1945. Beneath a cliff of red stone near the village of Nag Hammadi, a farmer's shovel strikes clay. Inside, 13 leather-bound codices sealed since the 4th century. Pages of Coptic script whisper from the dust, and the ruler said, "I am God, and there is no other beside me." But the next line changes everything, for he was blind. In that single word, blind, the ancient order of heaven cracked. The God of Genesis, the creator of all matter, the judge of Eden, might have been an impostor. This is the story of how early seekers of truth, the Gnostics, reimagined creation as a cosmic mistake. A world built not by God, but by a flawed being who mistook himself for one. The question that haunted them still echoes today. What if the God who made the world wasn't the true God at all? Muhammad Ali al-Samman did not know he was about to change history. He was looking for fertilizer, sebak, the nitrogen-rich soil that accumulates near ancient settlements. The cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif rose behind him, their sandstone faces carved by millennia of wind. The Nile moved somewhere in the distance, carrying the same water it had carried when Cleopatra ruled, when Alexander conquered, when the pyramids were already ancient. The desert here is not empty, it remembers. His shovel struck something that was not earth. The sound was different, hollow, purposeful. He knelt and began to dig with his hands, pulling away centuries of accumulated sand until the shape emerged. A sealed jar nearly a metre tall, red clay hardened by time. For a moment he hesitated. In the folklore of Upper Egypt, such jars could contain jinns, spirits that might curse or bless, depending on their mood and the worthiness of the one who freed them. He raised his mattock and brought it down. The jar shattered. No jinns emerged, but something perhaps more dangerous. Ideas that had been buried for 1,600 years, wrapped in leather and bound with string, waiting for light. Inside were 13 codices, books made of papyrus leaves bound between wooden covers and wrapped in gazelle leather. The pages were covered in Coptic script, the final evolution of the ancient Egyptian language, written in Greek letters. Some were in near perfect condition, preserved by the dryness of the desert and the protection of their clay tomb. Others had deteriorated, their words fragmentary, their sentences incomplete, like voices calling across a vast distance that had almost, but not quite, faded into silence. Muhammad Ali took them home, not understanding their significance. His mother used some of the pages to kindle her oven fire. Others were distributed among his family and neighbours, bartered, sold to local antiquities dealers for small sums. It would take years for scholars to track down all the pieces, to reconstruct what had been found, to begin the work of translation and interpretation that continues to this day. Among the texts were gospels that had never been canonized, apocalypses that imagined different ends of the world, secret teachings attributed to Jesus and his disciples. There was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings without narrative, beginning with the words, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." There was the Gospel of Philip, which spoke of Mary Magdalene as the companion of Jesus, whom he loved more than all the disciples, kissing her often on the mouth. There was the Gospel of Truth, attributed to the early Christian teacher Valentinus, which reimagined salvation not as rescue from sin, but as awakening from ignorance. But the text that would prove most revolutionary, most challenges to everything the Western world thought it knew about the origins of Christian thought, was the Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John. It told a creation story, but not the creation story anyone recognized. In its pages, the God of Genesis was not the ultimate divine, not the source of all being, but something far stranger and far more troubling. A mistake, a cosmic accident, a being of immense power and absolute blindness who declared himself God because he knew nothing beyond his own existence. "I am God," he proclaimed, "and there is no other beside me." And the text responded with devastating simplicity. By announcing this, He indicated to the angels who attended him that there exists another God. For if there were no other one, of whom would he be jealous? The implications were staggering. If the creator of the material world was not the true God, then everything built on that assumption, the entire edifice of orthodox Christian theology, the relationship between creator and creation, the problem of evil, the nature of salvation, would have to be reconsidered. More than reconsidered, reimagined entirely. When the first scholars began to examine these texts in detail, they realized they were looking at evidence of a form of Christianity that had been almost completely erased from history. The Church Fathers had written against it, condemned it, burned its books, and silenced its teachers. But here, preserved by accident in the dry Egyptian climate, was the voice of that lost tradition, speaking directly across the centuries without the filter of its opponents' polemics. Jean Dorès, a French scholar who was among the first to study the manuscripts, recognized immediately that this was not simply another cachet of ancient texts. This was proof of a fully developed alternative Christian theology, sophisticated and coherent, that had flourished in the early centuries of the faith before being driven underground and eventually extinguished. The implications for understanding the diversity of early Christianity were profound. James Robinson, who later led the project to translate and publish the complete Nag Hammadi library in English, described the discovery as comparable in significance to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but where the Dead Sea Scrolls illuminated the Jewish background of Christianity, the Nag Hammadi texts revealed the radical diversity within Christianity itself, the fierce debates over the nature of God, the meaning of creation, the purpose of human existence, and the path to salvation that characterized the first centuries of the new faith. The text spoke of gnosis, knowledge but not mere intellectual knowledge. This was transformative knowledge, salvific knowledge, the kind of knowing that changed everything. It was knowledge of one's true origin, one's divine nature, the secret of how spirit came to be trapped in matter and how it could be freed. It was knowledge that the world was not what it seemed, that reality itself was a kind of prison, and that awakening to this fact was the first step toward liberation. And at the centre of this cosmology, the architect of the prison was a figure the text called by various names: Yaldabaoth, Saklas, Samael, the Demiurge, the false god, the blind god, the god who created the world. To understand the shock of the Nag Hammadi discovery, we must first understand what Christianity looked like in its earliest centuries, before there was such a thing as orthodoxy, before the Bible as we know it existed, before the Church had consolidated its power and defined its doctrines with imperial backing. Imagine Alexandria in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The great library, though diminished from its former glory, still stands as a beacon of learning. The Ferrer's lighthouse guides ships into one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean world. The city is a crossroads of cultures, languages, and faiths. Egyptian priests maintain the old temples. Jewish scholars debate the meaning of scripture in synagogues throughout the Jewish quarter. Greek philosophers teach in the streets and colonnades, carrying forward the traditions of Plato and Pythagoras. And everywhere people argue about Jesus. Who was he? What did he teach? What did his death mean? What did his resurrection accomplish? Is he to be understood as a human prophet, a divine messenger, God himself in human form, or something else entirely, perhaps a celestial being who only appeared to be human, whose crucifixion was an illusion, whose real message was not about sacrifice but about secret knowledge? There are communities that follow the teachings of Paul, emphasizing faith and grace and the redemptive power of Christ's death. There are communities that treasure the memory of Jesus' brother James, who led the church in Jerusalem and insisted that followers of Jesus should continue to observe Jewish law. There are communities that revere Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles, the one who truly understood Jesus' teachings and to whom he revealed mysteries he shared with no one else. There are communities that use the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel of Mark, or texts we no longer have, or no written Gospels at all, relying instead on oral traditions passed down from teacher to student. And there are communities, numerous, widespread, intellectually sophisticated that call themselves Gnostics, the knowing ones, who teach that the material world is a prison created by an inferior deity, that the true God is utterly transcendent and unknowable, and that salvation comes not through faith or works but through gnosis, the experiential realization of one's divine origin and the recognition that the physical realm is a tragic mistake. In Rome, Valentinus teaches his version of Christian theology to growing crowds. He is brilliant, charismatic, well-versed in Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture. Some say he was nearly elected Bishop of Rome, missing the position by a narrow margin. Had history turned slightly differently, his teachings might have become the foundation of Catholic theology, and what we now call Gnosticism might have been orthodoxy. But he loses the political battle, his school is marginalised, and his numerous writings are eventually lost. We know them now only through the refutations of his opponents and fragments preserved in Nag Hammadi. In Antioch, another teacher named Basilides offers his own complex cosmology. He teaches that there are 365 heavens, stacked one above another, and that the God of the Jews rules only the lowest realm. The true God, he says, is beyond all of them, beyond even the concept of being itself, and can only be known through direct revelation. His son Isidore continues his teaching, expanding it, defending it against critics. In Asia Minor, Marcion, son of a Bob bishop, wealthy, influential, arrives in Rome around 40 CE with a radical proposal. He argues that the God revealed by Jesus is completely different from the God of the Old Testament. The Old Testament God is just, but justice requires punishment. The God of Jesus is pure mercy, pure love, requiring nothing, demanding nothing, forgiving everything. Marcion collects the letters of Paul and a version of the Gospel of Luke, creating perhaps the first Christian canon, but a canon built on rejection of the Jewish scriptures. The church condemns him, expels him, keeps his money, and sets about creating its own canon, partly in response to his challenge. Further east in Mesopotamia, Mani experiences visions and creates a new synthesis, blending Christian, Buddhist, and Zoroastrian elements into a dualistic cosmology that will spread from Spain to China. Manichaean communities will survive for 1,000 years, until they too are hunted down and destroyed. These are not marginal figures teaching in obscure corners. They are major intellectuals of their age, drawing large followings, establishing schools, training disciples, writing sophisticated theological treatises. The form of Christianity we now recognize as orthodox is just one voice among many, and in these early centuries it is not at all clear that it will prevail. What we call the New Testament does not yet exist as a defined collection. Various communities use different gospels, different letters, different texts. The Gospel of John, which will eventually be canonized, is suspected by some of Gnostic tendencies. Its opening lines about the Logos dwelling with God, its emphasis on light and darkness, its Jesus who speaks in riddles and reveals secret knowledge to his inner circle. The Gospel of Thomas, which will eventually be rejected, is used widely, and may be as old as, or older than the canonical Gospels. The councils that will define Christian orthodoxy have not yet been called. The creeds that will establish what Christians must believe have not yet been written. The Roman Empire is not yet Christian. It is in fact actively persecuting Christians of all varieties, making no distinction between those who will later be called Orthodox and those who will be called heretics. To the Roman authorities, they are all troublesome cultists who refuse to honour the gods and the emperor. In this fluid, diverse, contentious environment, ideas circulate freely. Teachers borrow from each other, refute each other, synthesize competing visions into new system. Texts are copied, modified, expanded, combined. There is no pope to declare what is true and what is false, and there is no Bible to serve as the final authority. There is no state power to enforce uniformity. There is only argument, persuasion, the slow work of building communities and convincing people that your understanding of the Jesus event is the correct one. Into this intellectual ferment, the Gnostic teachers bring a vision of stunning boldness. What if everything you think you know about God and creation is backwards? What if the world's beauty is a trap, its order a prison, its creator not the supreme being but a deluded tyrant? What if salvation is not about being saved by God, but about being saved from the God of this world? What if the serpent in Eden was the hero, and Adam's disobedience was the beginning of wisdom? These ideas are not invented out of nothing. They draw on currents of thought that run deep in the ancient world. Plato taught that the material realm is a shadow, an imperfect copy of eternal forms. The Orphic mysteries spoke of the soul's divine origin and its imprisonment in flesh. Jewish apocalyptic texts imagined hierarchies of angels and complex cosmologies of multiple heavens. Persian Zoroastrianism portrayed the world as a battleground between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and the lie. But the Gnostics synthesize these elements into something new and radical. They take the Jewish creation story and invert it. They take the Christian message of salvation and relocate it from a future kingdom to a present awakening. They take Platonic philosophy and mythologize it into a grand narrative of cosmic fall and redemption. The result is a vision of reality that is both deeply pessimistic. The material world is a mistake, a prison, a realm of suffering ruled by ignorant powers, and profoundly optimistic. The divine spark within each person is indestructible, and Gnosis can liberate it, returning it to its true home beyond the material cosmos. For the thinkers who will establish Christian orthodoxy, this vision is intolerable, not because it is incomprehensible or obviously false, but because it is compelling, sophisticated, and dangerous. It threatens the entire project of creating a unified Christian church with a clear hierarchy, defined doctrines, and the claim to be the sole guardian of truth. If matter is evil, what is the point of the incarnation? If the Creator is not the true God, what authority do the Scriptures have? If salvation comes through secret knowledge rather than faith in the sacraments administered by the Church, what is the role of bishops and priests? The battle lines are drawn. The struggle for the soul of Christianity begins, and the Gnostics, for all their intellectual sophistication and spiritual passion, will lose. Irenaeus of Lyon was a child when he sat at the feet of Polycarp, the old bishop who claimed to have known the Apostle John. He heard the stories of Jesus from a man who heard them from a man who knew Jesus. This chain of transmission mattered to Irenaeus. It was proof of authenticity, a guarantee of truth. The teachings passed down through the bishops in unbroken succession from the apostles were reliable. Everything else was innovation, corruption, falsehood. By the time Irenaeus became Bishop of Lyon in Gaul around 177 CE, he had spent years studying the teachings of the various Gnostic schools. He knew their scriptures, their cosmologies, their arguments. He understood them well enough to be frightened by them. And so he wrote, Against Heresies, the full title of which is The Detection and Overthrow of the False Gnosis, is a massive work, running to 5 volumes in its complete form. It is our primary source for understanding what the Gnostics taught, because Irenaeus quotes them extensively, though always with the intention of refuting them. Reading Irenaeus is like hearing one side of a fierce argument. We can reconstruct what the other side must have said, but we hear it through the filter of a hostile witness. The Gnostics, Irenaeus writes, are like a man who takes a beautiful image of a king made of precious jewels and dissolves it, and rearranges the stones to make the image of a dog or a fox. They take the scriptures, he says, and twist them to mean things never intended. They claim secret traditions passed down from the apostles, but these traditions contradict the public teachings of the Church. They speak of multiple gods, hierarchies of divine beings, a creator who is not the true God. Ideas that Irenaeus finds not only false but blasphemous. His central concern is epistemological. How do we know what is true? The Gnostics claim direct revelation, personal law, gnosis, secret teachings. But this, Irenaeus argues, is a recipe for chaos. Anyone can claim to have received special knowledge. There is no way to adjudicate between competing claims of private revelation. The result is a proliferation of sects, each with its own cosmology, its own saviour figures, its own path to salvation. Some Gnostic teachers, he notes with exasperation, seem to take pride in inventing new systems, as if novelty itself were a virtue. Against this chaos, Irenaeus proposes a different criterion for truth: apostolic succession and the rule of faith. The true teachings are those that have been passed down publicly from the apostles to the bishops in an unbroken chain. The churches founded by the apostles, Rome, Ephesus, Smyrna, preserve the authentic tradition. The scriptures, rightly interpreted according to this tradition, are the final authority, and the rule of faith, the Bailey outline of Christian belief that all true churches agree on, provides the framework for correct interpretation. This is a fundamentally conservative argument. It privileges tradition over innovation, institution over individual experience, public teaching over private revelation. It is also, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, brilliant. It provides a clear basis for distinguishing true teaching from false, a mechanism for maintaining unity, and a way to marginalize those who claim alternative sources of authority. But for the Gnostics, Irenaeus' solution is itself the problem. They are not interested in preserving tradition. They believe that the tradition itself is flawed, that the public teachings of the Church are exoteric, suitable for the masses, but concealing deeper truths accessible only to those capable of receiving them. They point to passages in the New Testament where Jesus speaks of giving different teachings to different audiences, where he tells parables to the crowds but explains their true meaning privately to his disciples, where he says, "I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now." The Gnostics see themselves as the spiritual elite, the pneumatics, those who possess the spirit, in contrast to the psychics, those who live by soul and faith, and the hylics, those trapped in matter, incapable of salvation. This spiritual hierarchy mirrors the cosmic hierarchy they envision, and it justifies their claim to possess knowledge that others lack. This elitism is part of what makes Gnosticism intolerable to the emerging Orthodox Church. Christianity is supposed to be universal, its message available to all, Sliven-free, male and female, educated and illiterate. The Gnostic insistence that full salvation requires special knowledge, that some people are by nature incapable of receiving it, contradicts the egalitarian impulse at the heart of the gospel. But the deeper problem from the Orthodox perspective is the Gnostic teaching about creation. To say that the material world is evil, that the body is a prison, that the creator of the world is not the true God, this is not merely heresy. It is, in Irenaeus' view, a rejection of everything Judaism and Christianity stand for. The opening words of Genesis are, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." This is foundational. The world is not an accident, not a mistake, not a prison. It is the deliberate creation of a good God, and when God surveys what he has made, he declares it very good. The material realm is not evil. It is the arena of God's action, the place where salvation history unfolds, the creation that God so loves that he sends his Son to redeem it. To deny this, Irenaeus argues, is to pull the foundation out from under everything. If matter is evil, then the incarnation is impossible. God cannot truly take on flesh without being contaminated by it. If the body is a prison, then the resurrection makes no sense. Why would anyone want to be raised in a body? If the Creator is not the true God, then the scriptures are unreliable. Jesus' references to "my Father" are misleading or deceptive, and the entire narrative of salvation history from Abraham to the eschaton is a lie. Irenaeus devotes enormous energy to refuting Gnostic interpretations of Scripture. When the Gnostics point to Genesis 1:26, "Let us make man in our image," and argue that the plural indicates multiple creators, Irenaeus responds that this is simply God speaking to his word and wisdom, not evidence of multiple deities. When the Gnostics cite the serpent's promise, "You will be like God, knowing good and evil," as proof that the serpent was telling the truth, and that the Creator wanted to keep humanity in ignorance, Irenaeus insists that the serpent was lying, that Adam and Eve were not ready for the knowledge they grasped prematurely, and that their disobedience brought death into the world. Reading Irenaeus' refutations, we can sense his frustration. The Gnostics are smart. Their arguments are sophisticated. They know the scriptures well and use them effectively. They have developed complex cosmologies that account for the problem of evil, explain the origin of suffering, and provide a path to liberation. They are winning converts, establishing communities, writing texts that rival the emerging New Testament in their spiritual and literary power. But Irenaeus believes he has truth on his side, and more than truth, he has the weight of tradition, the authority of the apostolic churches, and increasingly the support of the Roman state. The Gnostics may be sophisticated, but they are also fragmented, divided into competing schools, lacking institutional structure, vulnerable to persecution both from pagan authorities and from the growing power of the Orthodox Church. The tide is turning. The battle over what Christianity will become is entering its decisive phase. And the question at the centre of that battle is simple and profound. Is the God who created the world the true God? Or is he something else, something less, something tragically, cosmically mistaken about his own nature? In the Apocryphon of John, written in the voice of Christ speaking to his disciple, the answer is given with stunning clarity. The ruler said, "I am God, and there is no other besides me." When he said this, he sinned against all the immortal beings who heard him, and they laid blame against him. Then when the mother heard him speak, she cried out against him. The Creator's declaration of uniqueness is not a statement of fact, but an admission of ignorance. He does not know that there are realms above him, powers beyond him, a source from which even he ultimately derives. His blindness is not metaphorical. It is the central tragedy of creation. The architect of the material world does not understand what he has made or why he has made it. He mistakes his local authority for universal sovereignty. He is, in the devastating language of the text, blind and ignorant and arrogant. This is the heresy that will not stand. This is the teaching that must be refuted, suppressed, and if necessary, eliminated by force. Not because it is obviously false, but because it is compellingly dangerous. Before anything existed, before light, before time, before thought itself, there was the One, the monad, the unknown Father, absolute transcendence beyond all categories, beyond being and non-being, beyond presence and absence, not a personal God who creates and commands, but the infinite source from which all existence emanates. The Gnostic texts struggle to describe this ultimate reality because human language is designed for the realm of multiplicity, difference, and change. How do you speak about that which precedes all speech? How do you name that which is before all names? The authors resort to negation, piling up phrases to indicate what the unknown Father is not visible, not knowable, not comprehensible, not definable. He is the invisible one who is above everything. As the Apocryphon of John puts it, he is ineffable and unproclaimable. He dwells in silence and stillness. Yet this ultimate unity is not static. Within its perfect stillness, something moves. The one contemplates itself, though contemplates is too active a word for what occurs. The one simply is, and in its being it knows itself, and in its knowing it generates. From the unknown Father emanates the first divine principle. Barbelo, whose name may mean God in for, or may be a corruption of Hebrew words meaning God's daughter. She is the first thought, the beginning of multiplicity within unity, the mirror in which the one sees itself, and from the union of the one and Barbelo, though union implies two separate entities where there is really only progressive emanation, comes a cascade of divine beings called eons. These are not separate gods in the polytheistic sense, but aspects of the divine fullness, facets of the one self-knowledge, each representing an attribute or principle: mind, truth, logos, life, human, church, Together they constitute the Werte. Pleroma, the fullness of the divine realm, a hierarchy of light and knowledge extending downward from the absolute simplicity of the one toward increasing complexity and differentiation. This system draws heavily on Platonic philosophy, particularly the Middle Platonic conception of a transcendent one from which all reality derives. But the Gnostics mythologize these abstract philosophical principles, giving them names and relationships, turning metaphysics into narrative. The result is something between theology and poetry, a cosmology that operates simultaneously as a philosophical argument and sacred story. In some Gnostic systems, there are 30 aeons arranged in complementary pairs, male and female, each generation proceeding from the one above it. In others, the structure is simpler, focusing on just a few key principles. But across the various schools, Sethian, Valentinian, Basilidian, certain patterns recur, a transcendent origin, a process of emanation, a hierarchy of divine principles, and eventually a disruption, a fall, a tragedy that leads to the creation of the material cosmos. That tragedy centers on Sophia, wisdom, the youngest of the eons. In the Valentinian version of the myth, Sophia desires to know the father directly, without her consort, violating the principle of pairing that structures the pleroma. Her desire is not evil, it is in fact a natural aspiration, the longing to return to the source. But it is premature, undertaken without the consent and balance of her partner, and because the father is ultimately unknowable, her desire cannot be fulfilled. Instead, it produces a distortion, an aberration, a formless passion that has existence but not form, presence but not perfection. The Sethian texts describe this differently, but with similar themes. Sophia, looking down from the heights of the pleroma, sees her reflection in the waters of chaos below. In some versions, she falls in love with her own reflection. In others, she simply attempts to create without her consort, acting alone when she should act in partnership. The result is the same, a birth that should not have happened, an offspring that is deformed, powerful but ignorant, possessing creative force but lacking the wisdom and knowledge that would enable it to create rightly. This being is Yaldabaoth, whose very name signifies error. Some scholars suggest it derives from Aramaic words meaning child of chaos. Others propose Hebrew roots suggesting Lord of Hosts, used ironically. In the texts, he is also called Saklas, the foolish one, and Samael, which may mean blind god. He is Sophia's bastard child, conceived in passion and ignorance, born into the void between the pleroma and the abyss of non-being. The texts describe his appearance with disturbing vividness. He has the body of a serpent and the face of a lion, his eyes blazing with fire, his form radiating chaotic power. He is, the Apocryphon of John tells us, imperfect, misshapen and arrogant. He emerges from Sophia's womb already full-grown, already possessing immense creative potential, but utterly lacking in understanding. He does not know where he came from. He does not know his mother. He does not know that there is anything above him. Sophia is horrified by what she has produced. In some versions, she immediately casts him away from her, down into the darkness, separating him from the pleroma so that the other aeons will not see her error. In others, she herself is cast out with him, falling from the divine realm into a lower region where she will remain trapped, lamenting her mistake, seeking to rectify it, working in secret to undermine and eventually overthrow the false creation her passion has brought into being. Yaldabaoth finds himself alone in the darkness. He possesses enormous power, the power of a god, though he is not one. He inherits this power from his mother, who is herself an aeon, a member of the divine fullness. But he has none of her wisdom, none of her knowledge of the higher realms, none of her understanding of proper order and relationship. He is powerful and ignorant, creative and blind. And so he speaks the words that will echo through centuries of theology and critique. I am God, and there is no other Theo besides me. It is a declaration of sovereignty, but it is also a confession of ignorance. He proclaims himself God because he knows of no other. His universe consists of himself and the darkness around him. He has no memory of his origin, no awareness of his mother, no conception of the vast realms of light above him. His statement is technically true from his limited perspective. Within the scope of his awareness, there is no other God. But his awareness is profoundly limited, bounded by the very blindness that defines him. The higher powers hear his declaration and are appalled. By announcing this, the text explains, he indicated to the angels who attended him that there exists another God. For if there were no other one, of whom would he be jealous? His very claim to uniqueness implies the existence of others to whom the claim must be made, against whom his sovereignty must be asserted. His arrogance reveals his insecurity, and his insecurity reveals his ignorance. But Yaldabaoth does not hear the laughter from above. He does not sense the grief of his mother, who watches from her exile as her child compounds error with error, beginning the work that will lead to the creation of the material cosmos, a cosmos built not from divine wisdom but from divine tragedy, not as an expression of the Father's will, but as a consequence of a passion that exceeded its proper bounds. This is not the creation story taught in synagogues and churches. This is its dark mirror, its inversion, its heretical reinterpretation, and it changes everything. In the void between the pleroma and absolute nothingness, Yaldabaoth begins to create. He does not create from nothing, because he himself came from something, from Sophia's passion, from the power she possessed as Nehon, from the stolen or inherited portion of divine light that she transmitted to him despite his malformation. He creates from this power, shaping the chaotic potentiality around him into form, imposing order on disorder, establishing hierarchies and structures that mimic, dimly and imperfectly, the divine order of the pleroma above him. But his creation is imitation without understanding, form without content, structure without wisdom. He's like a child who has seen a cathedral and builds a copy from mud and sticks, capturing something of the external shape while missing entirely the principles of architecture, the symbolism of design, the purpose and meaning embedded in every element. Or perhaps worse, he is like someone dreaming who constructs an elaborate world governed by dream logic, compelling and coherent within the dream, but fundamentally disconnected from waking reality. His first act is to generate other beings to populate his realm. The texts call these archons, rulers or authorities. In some accounts, there are 7 of them, corresponding to the 7 classical planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. In other versions, there are 12, matching the signs of the zodiac. In still others, there are 365, one for each day of the year, each governing its own small domain within the cosmic machinery. These archons are Yaldabaoth's offspring, born from his thought as he was born from Sophia's thought. They inherit his power and his ignorance. They are vast beings, not human in scale or form, not benevolent or evil in human moral terms, but rather cosmic forces, personified principles of fate and necessity. They are the gods that rule this world. Not the true God, but the powers that govern matter, time, destiny, the movement of stars, the cycles of birth and death. To each archon, Yaldabaoth assigns a sphere, a level of the cosmic hierarchy. He himself presides from the 7th heaven, the highest realm of the material cosmos, but still infinitely below the pleroma. Below him, his archons rule their designated domains, and together they construct what the Gnostics call the hebdomad, the 7-fold structure of the lower cosmos, the prison of concentric spheres through which souls must pass to reach the material world, and through which they must return to escape it. This image of nested heavenly spheres was not invented by the Gnostics. It was the standard cosmology of the ancient world, derived from astronomical observation and philosophical speculation. Plato described it. Aristotle systematized it. Ptolemy mapped it. Jews and Christians adopted it, placing God and his angels in the highest heaven beyond the sphere of fixed stars. What the Gnostics do is take this widely accepted model and reinterpret it. The heavenly spheres are not the dwelling place of the true God, but the architecture of imprisonment, and the beings that rule them are not divine messengers but cosmic jailers. Each archon is given a name and attributes. Yaldabaoth himself is sometimes called Saklas the fool or Samael the blind. His offspring bear names that echo Hebrew angel names but distorted. Iao, Sabaoth, Adonaios, Eloeos, Astaphios, Yao, Eloeus. These names are recognizable. They are titles used in the Hebrew Bible for the God of Israel, but in the Gnostic texts, they are not names of the true God. They are titles claimed by the Demiurge and his subordinates, evidence of their pretension to divinity, their usurpation of names and honours that belong to higher powers they do not know exist. This is one of the most shocking aspects of Gnostic theology. The God of the Old Testament, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God who gives the law to Moses and speaks through the prophets, is identified with Yaldabaoth, the false creator. When he says, "I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other gods before me," the Gnostics hear the voice of the Demiurge, jealous and possessive, demanding exclusive worship because of he fears the truth of his own subordinate status. When he destroys the world in the flood, when he demands sacrifice, when he commands the slaughter of Israel's enemies, they see not perfect justice but imperfect power, not divine wisdom but archonic tyranny. This identification is what makes Gnosticism intolerable to Jews and Christians alike. It is not merely a different interpretation of Scripture, it is an inversion of values, a reclassification of good and evil, a claim that everything the tradition venerates is actually evidence of the very problem from which humanity needs to be saved. But the Gnostics are not arbitrary in this identification. They point to passages in the Old Testament that trouble traditional theology. The God who regrets creating humanity and resolves to destroy it. Does this sound like a perfect, omniscient deity? The God who walks in the garden in the cool of the day, calling out to Adam, "Where are you?" Does he not know? The God who accepts Abel's sacrifice but rejects Cain's for reasons that are never clearly explained. Is this justice? The God who hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he can demonstrate his power through plagues. Is this not manipulation? Orthodox theology develops sophisticated answers to these questions, invoking anthropomorphism, divine pedagogy, the inscrutability of God's purposes. The Gnostics offer a simpler answer. These passages reveal the character of a limited being who mistakes himself for the absolute, who possesses great power but not perfect knowledge, who is capable of emotion and error because he is not the true God but merely the most powerful of created beings. Having established his realm and populated it with his archonic offspring, Yaldabaoth looks upon his creation with satisfaction. The texts describe him dividing the cosmos into regions, establishing laws of nature, setting the heavenly bodies in their courses. He creates time and space, cause and effect, the cycles of generation and corruption. He institutes fate, hymemen in Greek, the inexorable chain of causation that governs material existence, the law that even the gods cannot violate, the machinery of necessity that will ensure that everything in the material realm unfolds according to predetermined patterns. This is the world we inhabit. Not the freely created work of a sovereign God who makes all things according to his perfect will, but the constructed prison of an ignorant demiurge who builds according to his limited understanding, producing a cosmos that is orderly and beautiful in its way, but fundamentally flawed, a system designed to trap spirit in matter, to keep souls cycling endlessly through birth, death, and rebirth, to prevent the divine spark scattered throughout creation from remembering their origin and returning to the pleroma. The architecture is elegant, the machinery is precise, The prison is beautiful, but it is still a prison, and its architect, magnificent in his power, terrible in his authority, cosmic in his scope, remains what he's always been, blind, ignorant, and utterly convinced of his own supremacy. The material cosmos as constructed by Yaldabaoth is not random chaos. It is ordered, structured, governed by laws. In this, the Gnostics agree with the Stoics, the Platonists with Jewish and Christian theology. The world exhibits design, purpose, regularity. Where they differ is in their assessment of what that design reveals. For the Stoic, the rational order of the cosmos demonstrates the presence of divine logos permeating all things. For the Platonist, the mathematical harmony of celestial motions reflects the eternal forms that serve as their blueprint. For the Jew or Christian, the beauty and complexity of creation declare the glory of God and attest to his wisdom. But for the Gnostic, the very perfection of the world's machinery is evidence of its prison-like nature. It is designed, yes, but designed to contain, to limit, to prevent escape. The architecture of this prison operates on multiple levels. At the cosmic scale, there are the 7 planetary spheres, each ruled by an archon, each imposing its influence on the realm below. The planets are not merely physical objects. They are living powers, intelligent forces, gods in their own right, subordinate only to the Demiurge. As they move through their courses, they determine fates, influence events, shape the characteristics and destinies of souls incarnating in the material realm. This astrological determinism was widely accepted in the ancient world. The movement of planets was thought to affect everything from the outcome of battles to the success of marriages to the health of crops. Birth charts calculated the position of celestial bodies at the moment of nativity, supposedly revealing an individual's character and fate. The gods of the planets, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, along with Sun and Moon, were worshipped and propitiated. What the Gnostics add to this common understanding is the claim that this astrological machinery is not neutral, not merely descriptive of cosmic order, but actively malevolent, a system designed by the archons to enslave humanity. The movement of planets does not reflect divine will. It constitutes the mechanism of fate, the means by which the archons control and predict the behaviour of incarnate souls. To be born under the influence of Mars is to be shaped by the archonic power governing war and conflict. To have Saturn in a prominent position is to be subject to the archon of limitation and death. At the biological level, the prison consists of the body itself. In Platonic philosophy, the body is a tomb, soma, as the phrase goes, a play on Greek words. The soul, originally free and immortal, becomes trapped in flesh, subject to its appetites and limitations, distracted by pleasure and pain from contemplation of eternal truths. The Gnostics adopt and radicalize this view. The body is not merely a temporary dwelling or a handicap to be endured. It is a deliberate construction by the Demiurge, designed specifically to imprison spirit in matter. In the Gnostic creation of humanity, which we will examine in detail shortly, the archons craft the physical body, modelling it after the image of a divine prototype but inverting its nature. Where the divine human is light and spirit, the material human is heavy and fleshly. Where the prototype is free and knowing, the copy is bound and ignorant. The body comes equipped with systems that ensure its continued bondage, hunger that drives it to consume, lust that drives it to reproduce, fear that keeps it clinging to existence, all mechanisms by which the archons ensure that souls remain trapped in the cycle of incarnation. At the psychological level, the prison consists of forgetfulness. This may be the most insidious aspect of the archonic system. Souls entering the material realm pass through the planetary spheres, and at each level they receive from the governing archon an aspect of embodied existence. At one level, the capacity for anger, at another, desire, at another, fear, and so on. But the most crucial thing they receive, or rather lose, is memory. By the time the soul reaches the material realm and incarnates in a body, it has forgotten its divine origin. It does not remember the pleroma. It does not know that it is a fragment of light imprisoned in darkness. It thinks the material world is the only reality, the body is its true identity, death is the final end. This ignorance is the most secure lock on the prison doors. Even if the soul manages to escape the body at death, if it still does not remember its true nature, it will simply reincarnate, entering another body, continuing the cycle. The Gnostics describe an elaborate geography of these intermediate realms. Between the pleroma and the material world are various boundaries, curtains, veils. The most significant is the firmament, a kind of cosmic barrier separating the eternal realm above from the material realm below. Yaldabaoth establishes this boundary to protect his creation from the influence of higher powers and to prevent souls from escaping upward. The Archons serve as guardians of this barrier, challenging any soul that attempts to ascend, demanding passwords and signs of recognition, turning back those who lack the necessary knowledge. This cosmology draws on widespread ancient beliefs about the difficulty of the soul's post-mortem journey. Egyptian religion described elaborate trials in the underworld, where the deceased had to pass through gates guarded by demons, answering questions and performing rituals to proceed. Greek mystery religions promised to equip initiates with knowledge of the afterlife geography and the passwords needed to navigate it successfully. Jewish apocalyptic texts describe multiple heavens through which seers travelled in visions, encountering angels who challenged them at each level. The Gnostics synthesized these ideas into a comprehensive system. The soul's journey is not merely difficult, it is actively opposed by cosmic powers determined to prevent escape. The passwords and signs are not just helpful information, they are essential weapons in a spiritual war. And the knowledge needed for liberation is not general wisdom or ethical virtue, but specific gnosis, the revelation of one's true identity, the recognition that one is not a creature of the Demiurge but a fragment of the divine, a spark of the true God fallen into matter but never truly belonging to it. Within the material realm itself, the Archons maintain control through multiple mechanisms. They govern the cycles of nature: birth, growth, decay, death, rebirth. They regulate the elements: earth, water, air, fire. They influence human society through what we would now call ideology, the beliefs, values and assumptions that people accept without question, that seem natural and inevitable but actually serve to maintain the archonic order. The law is one such mechanism. Not moral law in the sense of ethical principles, but the Jewish Torah, the commandments given at Sinai. For Orthodox Jews and Christians, the law is divine revelation, God's instruction to humanity about how to live rightly. For the Gnostics, it is the Demiurge's attempt to control human behaviour, to establish himself as the legitimate authority, to keep humanity obedient and ignorant. The prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge in Eden is particularly revealing. The Demiurge does not want humans to know. Knowledge threatens his control. Similarly, the prophets who speak in the name of the Lord, the priests who offer sacrifices, the kings who rule by divine right, all these are, from the Gnostic perspective, servants of the Demiurge, whether they know it or not. They perpetuate the system, maintain the illusion, reinforce the prison walls. To obey the law, to honour the priests, to submit to the king, is to collaborate in one's own enslavement. Yet the world is beautiful. This is the deepest paradox of Gnostic thought, the tension that their system must somehow accommodate. If the material cosmos is a prison, if the Creator is blind and ignorant, if the Archons are tyrants, why is the world so breathtaking in its complexity, so elegant in its order, so rich in its diversity? Why do flowers bloom? Why does music move the soul? Why does love exist? The Gnostic answer is nuanced. The beauty of the world is real, but it is derivative. Yaldabaoth, though ignorant, is powerful, and he inherited his power from Sophia, who is herself an aeon, part of the divine fullness. When he creates according to patterns he dimly perceives, archetypes that filter down from the pleroma, reflected and distorted through multiple levels of emanation, until they reach his awareness of the vague impressions which he then attempts to realize in matter. The result is a world that contains echoes of divine beauty, fragments of true order, but always mixed with ignorance, always limited by the flaws of its architect. It is like a painting copied by someone who has never seen the original, working only from descriptions and faded reproductions. The copy has beauty, certainly. It may even be impressive in its own right, but it is fundamentally second-hand, derivative, removed from the source, and for those who have seen or remember the original, the copy can only provoke longing, a painful awareness of what is missing, what is lost, what the copy attempts to capture but cannot. This is the Gnostic view of material beauty, not something to be rejected entirely, not something devoid of value, but something that should provoke in the aware soul a sense of homesickness, a remembrance of the true beauty beyond the material realm, the pure light of the pleroma from which all lesser light derives. And so the trap is complete, the architecture is in place, the machinery is running, the illusion is compelling. Souls enter the material realm, forget their origin, become absorbed in the dramas and pleasures and pains of embodied existence, die, pass through the archonic realms without the knowledge needed to escape, and return to material incarnation, again and again, generation after generation, cycling endlessly through the prison that they do not recognize as such. Unless something changes, unless knowledge breaks through, unless the divine world above remembers its lost fragments and sends aid. In the beginning, before humanity, the Archons gazed into the waters of chaos and saw a reflection. The texts are precise about this. They did not see their own reflection. They saw the image of something from above, the form of a divine being projected down from the pleroma into their realm. This is the anthropos, the primal human, the perfect image of the divine, which in some Gnostic systems is itself one of the eons, a member of the divine fullness. This vision troubles the Archons. Yaldabaoth, seeing the image, recognizes dimly that it is greater than himself, though he does not understand how or why. The reflection possesses a beauty, a completeness, a perfection that his own creation lacks, and in his arrogance and ignorance, he decides to imitate it. "Come," he says to his fellow Archons, "let's create a human according to the image of God and according to our likeness, so that its image may become a light for us." This is the Gnostic interpretation of Genesis chapter 1:26, where God says, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness." The plural is not, as Orthodox theologians claim, merely a majestic usage or God consulting with his word and wisdom. It is the Demiurge speaking to his Archons, proposing to copy the divine image they have glimpsed, attempting to capture its light within the material realm they have created. The Archons set to work. Each contributes to the construction of the material human body. In some texts, each Archon creates a specific part. One forms the bones, another the sinews, another the flesh, and so on, until the complete physical structure is assembled. Other texts provide elaborate correspondences. Each Archon contributes an aspect of the body that mirrors his own cosmic domain, so that the human being becomes a microcosm, a small world that reflects the structure of the larger cosmos, with the planetary spheres corresponding to organs and systems within the body. The result is a material form, lying on the ground, beautiful in its shape because it copies the divine image, but lifeless. The Archons have managed to create the container, the structure, the mechanical apparatus, but they cannot animate it. They possess power, but not life in the true sense. They are themselves secondary, derivative beings, removed from the source of all vitality. The body they have made is like a perfectly crafted instrument that produces no music, a machine with all its parts in place but no power source to activate it. Yaldabaoth stares at the inert form, frustrated and troubled. He senses that something is missing, but he does not know what or how to provide it. And this is where the cosmic drama takes its decisive turn. Sophia, watching from her exile, sees her chance to rectify the tragedy her passion has caused. She cannot directly oppose Yaldabaoth. He is too powerful, and she is diminished by her fall from the Pleroma. But she can work through deception, through the ignorance that defines him. She causes the higher powers to speak to Yaldabaoth, though he does not recognize the source of the voice he hears. They say to him, "Breathe some of your spirit into its face, and the body will arise." Yaldabaoth, thinking himself supreme, thinking the voice is his own idea, complies. He leans down to the lifeless clay and breathes, and with his breath, he unknowingly transfers something precious, the power he inherited from Sophia, the spark of divine light that has been within him since his origin, though he never understood its nature or source. This light passes from him into the material body, and Adam rises. The moment is both triumph and tragedy. The Archons have succeeded in creating a being that can move, think, speak, but they have done so only by diminishing themselves, by giving away the very thing that made them powerful. And worse, the human they have created is now superior to them in a crucial respect. The divine spark within Adam is conscious, knowing, capable of recognizing truth. Adam understands more than his creators understand. He sees the Archons for what they are, limited, ignorant, subordinate beings playing at divinity. The Apocryphon of John describes the Archons' reaction. They were greatly disturbed. They had wanted to create a being beneath themselves, and instead they had created one superior to themselves. In some versions of the myth, Adam begins immediately to speak wisdom, to demonstrate knowledge the Archons do not possess, to praise the true God whom the Archons do not know exists. They realize they have been tricked, though they do not understand how or by whom. Yaldabaoth, most of all, is enraged. He has been robbed. The power that was his, or that he thought was his, has been transferred to the creature he meant to dominate. His solution is brutal and strategic. If he cannot reclaim the light, he will imprison it. He casts Adam into the depths of matter, into the most material part of material creation, binding the spirit as deeply in flesh as possible. The luminous body Adam initially possessed becomes heavy, opaque, mortal. Spiritual vision becomes physical sight, limited to the material realm. Knowledge becomes subject to forgetting, but even this is not sufficient to contain the threat. The divine spark, though imprisoned, is still present. So Yaldabaoth devises another strategy: distraction. He creates paradise, the Garden of Eden, and places Adam within it. The garden is beautiful, full of pleasures, designed to absorb Adam's attention, to make him forget his divine origin, to focus his awareness entirely on the material realm. "Eat of every tree in the garden," Yaldabaoth tells him, "but do not eat of the tree of knowledge, for the day you eat of it, you will surely die." The Gnostic interpretation of this prohibition is devastating in its simplicity. The Demiurge does not want Adam to know. Knowledge is the threat. Knowledge is what might enable Adam to recognize his true nature, to remember his divine origin, to see through the illusion of material reality, and to seek escape from the archonic prison. The tree of knowledge is not a test of obedience. It is the one thing in the garden that could lead to liberation, and therefore it must be forbidden. But Yaldabaoth has made an error. He has placed the instrument of awakening within the prison itself. The tree stands in the center of the garden, visible, accessible, its fruit within reach. All that is needed is for Adam to realize that the prohibition itself is suspicious, that a truly benevolent creator would not forbid knowledge, that the threat of death may be a lie told to maintain control. And into the garden comes the serpent. The serpent in Gnostic mythology is not what Orthodox Christianity made it. It is not Satan, not a demon, not evil incarnate. It is an emissary from the divine realm, sent by Sophia or by the true God to begin the work of liberating the trapped light. In some texts, the serpent is called the instructor, or the revealer. In others, it is explicitly identified as Christ in a pre-incarnate form, descending into the material realm to awaken humanity from the Archon's deception. Before the serpent arrives, however, there is Eve. The Gnostic account of her creation differs significantly from Genesis. In the biblical narrative, Eve is made from Adam's rib, secondary and derivative. In the Gnostic version, she is sent from above, a spiritual principle entering the material realm to complete what was begun with Adam's creation. She is not merely Adam's companion, she is his awakener, the one who carries wisdom, who will be the means by which Gnosis enters the human race. Some texts identify Eve specifically with Zoe, life, one of the aeons from the Pleroma. She descends into Adam, becomes one with him, and then is separated out by the Archons who, recognizing her power, attempt to control her by giving her material form. But even in material form, she retains her spiritual essence, her connection to the higher realms, her role as bearer of knowledge. The Archons create a material Eve, but they cannot capture the spiritual Eve who remains hidden, guiding her material counterpart, working to undermine the Archonic order from within. This doubling, spiritual Eve and material Eve, inner truth and outer appearance, becomes a recurring theme in Gnostic thought. The principle that reality is not what it appears, that behind every material form is a spiritual truth that the Archons cannot fully control. When the serpent approaches Eve, it is not temptation that is offered, but revelation. The conversation in the Gnostic texts mirrors Genesis, but with crucial inversions of meaning. The serpent asks, "Has God said you shall not eat of every tree in the garden?" Eve responds that they may eat of all except the tree of knowledge, for God said if you eat of it, you will die. And the serpent speaks truth. You will not die. The deity knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will become like divine beings, knowing good and evil. In Genesis, this is the lie that leads to the fall. In the Gnostic reading, this is truth spoken against the Demiurge's lie. Eve and Adam do not die when they eat the fruit. Not immediately, not in any final sense. Their eyes are opened. They do gain knowledge. And the Demiurge's reaction, his rage, his curses, his expulsion of them from the garden, confirms that he feared this outcome, that he tried to prevent it not for their good, but for his own security. The knowledge gained from the tree is gnosis, recognition of the divine spark within, awareness of the distinction between the true God and the false creator, understanding of the archonic system and how it functions. In the moment of eating, Adam and Eve awaken. They become, as the serpent promised, like divine beings, not in power but in knowledge, in awareness, in the possession of consciousness that sees beyond the material realm. The Archons respond with panic and rage. In the hypostasis of the Archons, the reality of the rulers, the text describes their reaction. The rulers came to their Adam. When they saw his female companion speaking with him, they were greatly disturbed and became enamored with her. They said to one another, "Come, let us sow our seed in her," and they pursued her. But she laughed at them for their foolishness and their blindness. The spiritual Eve cannot be captured or violated. She is not subject to the Archon's power, but they attempt to defile the material Eve, to corrupt humanity through sexual violence, to establish their dominion through force. The attempt fails or succeeds only partially, depending on the version of the text. But the principle is established. The Archons maintain control through violence, through domination, through the attempt to make humanity forget its divine origin through trauma and brutality. Yaldabaoth curses the serpent, condemns it to crawl on its belly, establishes enmity between it and humanity. He curses Eve with pain in childbirth and subordination to Adam. He curses Adam with toil and sweat, with a life of labour extracting sustenance from resistant earth. And most significantly, he expels them from the garden lest they eat also from the tree of life and live forever, preserving their newfound gnosis in immortal bodies beyond his control. But the curses, from the Gnostic perspective, are evidence of Yaldabaoth's weakness, not his strength. He can make life difficult, but he cannot reclaim the knowledge that has been gained. He can imprison the body more securely, but he cannot extinguish the divine spark. He can introduce death as a threat, but death might actually be liberation, an opportunity for the soul to escape the material realm and return to its source. The expulsion from Eden is not the fall. It is the beginning of awakening. Exile from the garden is exile from illusion, from the carefully constructed prison that appeared to be paradise. Now, cast into the harsh material world subject to pain and death, Adam and Eve will suffer. But they will also have the opportunity to develop wisdom, to learn from experience, to remember over generations what they have forgotten, to pass down the secret knowledge from teacher to student, from parent to child, keeping alive the possibility of liberation. The Gnostic reading of Eden inverts everything. Disobedience becomes the first virtuous act, the serpent is the hero. The tree of knowledge is the instrument of salvation. The angry God who curses and expels is revealed as the tyrant he is. And humanity, cast into a world of suffering, carries within itself the seed of rebellion, the divine spark that no amount of material imprisonment can fully extinguish. This is the secret of the tree. Knowledge is more powerful than authority. Consciousness is more fundamental than creation. Truth persists even when suppressed. And the prison, no matter how elaborate, cannot hold those who recognize it for what it is. Once humanity possessed gnosis, even if only partially, even if it faded and had to be repeatedly rekindled, the cosmic order was never stable again. The archons could not simply rule over an ignorant humanity content to live within the boundaries established for it. They faced a permanent threat, awakened souls who recognized the archonic system, who resisted its control, who sought ways to escape. The response was systematic oppression on multiple levels. At the cosmic level, the archons reinforced the machinery of fate, the Haimamene that governed material existence. They tightened their control over the process of reincarnation, ensuring that souls would be caught in the cycle of birth and death, unable to break free. They established what the texts call the 7 gates or 7 seals, barriers that the soul must pass through in its ascent after death, each guarded by an archon demanding passwords and signs of recognition that most souls do not possess. At the terrestrial level, they worked through their representatives, kings and priests, legal codes and social structures, anything that enforced conformity and suppressed knowledge. The Gnostic texts are not usually concerned with political resistance. They are not revolutionary in the ordinary sense, but they implicitly critique all earthly authority by portraying it as subordinate to and serving the interests of the archonic powers. The most elaborate descriptions of the archonic hierarchy come from the magical papyri and related texts that circulated in the late ancient world. These documents provide detailed maps of the heavenly realms, lists of the names and attributes of the archons, instructions for how to address them, compel them, or avoid them. They reflect a worldview in which the cosmos is densely populated with spiritual beings, most of them hostile or at least indifferent to human welfare, all of them capable of interfering with human life in various ways. The 7 planetary archons each had specific characteristics and areas of influence. The archon of Saturn governed time, limitation, death, the boundaries of material existence. The archon of Jupiter governed law, order, social hierarchy. Mars governed conflict, violence, the martial virtues and vices. Venus governed desire, sexuality, the binding force of attraction that keeps souls attached to the material realm. Mercury governed commerce, communication, the traffic between different levels of reality. The moon governed change, emotion, the cycles of birth and death. The sun in some systems was actually more benevolent, a reflection of higher light, but in others was simply the most powerful of the archons, Yaldabaoth himself in his solar aspect. As the planets move through their courses, they cast influences down upon the earth, shaping events, determining fates, posing their characters upon souls born under their dominion. A person born when Mars was ascendant would be martial in character, prone to anger and violence. A person born under Venus would be driven by desire and attraction. This was not mere superstition to the ancient mind. It was observable fact, confirmed by the correlation between celestial positions and earthly events. What the Gnostics added was the claim that this system was not natural or neutral, but deliberately constructed to enslave. The Archons had designed the machinery of astrology to function as a control mechanism, a means of predicting and shaping human behaviour, of ensuring that souls would act according to patterns that kept them trapped in the material realm. Breaking free required more than just moral virtue or religious devotion. It required specific knowledge, the true names of the Archons, the passwords to speak at the gates, the seals and signs that would compel the guardians to let the ascending soul pass. This knowledge was secret, passed down orally from teacher to student, or recorded in texts that were deliberately obscure, coded, protected from those who lack the preparation to understand them. The Gnostic initiation rites, insofar as we can reconstruct them from fragmentary evidence, seem to have involved some form of visionary ascent, perhaps induced by meditation, fasting, or other spiritual disciplines. The initiate would experientially journey through the heavenly spheres while still alive, encountering the Archons, learning their names and natures, acquiring the knowledge needed to pass them in safety. This was not metaphorical. The experience was understood as a real journey through real realms, a preview and a preparation for the journey the soul would make after death. Some texts describe elaborate passwords and rituals. At the first gate, the soul might be challenged by the Archon who demands, "Who are you and where are you from?" The soul must respond with the correct formula. "I am a child of light, and I come from the light." The Archon might then demand proof, a sign or seal. The soul produces it, perhaps a hand gesture, perhaps a sacred word, and the Archon is compelled to stand aside. But even with the correct knowledge, the journey is perilous. The Archons are described as rapacious, greedy for the light that ascending souls carry. They attempt to confuse, threaten, seduce, or simply block the way through brute force. The soul must be vigilant, must remember its teachings, must not be distracted by the Archon's illusions or intimidated by their claims to authority. In some versions of the cosmology, not all Archons are entirely hostile. Sabaoth, one of Yaldabaoth's offspring, is said to have repented when he heard voices from the Pleroma praising the true God. He recognized his father's error, abandoned him, and established his own realm that is less oppressive, more aligned with the higher powers. The texts praise him. This is why he is called God of the Forces and Sabaoth, since he is above the forces of chaos, for the Mother established him because of his repentance. This introduces an element of complexity into the Gnostic cosmology. Not all powers in the cosmos are equally ignorant or equally malevolent. Some can be reformed. Some can become allies. The universe is not a simple dualism of the good and evil, but a hierarchy of beings with varying degrees of knowledge and varying relationships to the ultimate truth. Still, the fundamental structure remains. Souls are trapped. The Archons generally work to keep them trapped, and liberation requires both knowledge and struggle. The War of Heavens is not a one-time event, but an ongoing condition, perpetual tension between the forces of imprisonment and the forces of liberation, between ignorance and gnosis, between the archonic order and the divine realm that seeks to redeem its lost fragments. And into this cosmic war, at a specific moment in history, a specific place in the material realm, there descends from the Pleroma an emissary bearing knowledge, coming to awaken those capable of awakening, to gather the scattered light, to prepare souls for the final liberation. The Christ of the Gnostic texts is not the Christ of the creeds. He is not the only begotten Son of God incarnate to redeem humanity from sin through his sacrificial death and resurrection. Or rather, he is those things, but he is also something more, something stranger, something that orthodox theology would find deeply threatening. In the Apocryphon of John, Christ appears to the disciple after the resurrection, not in a physical body but as a luminous presence, a being of pure light who is simultaneously the child, the elder, and the servant, whose form shifts because he transcends form. He comes to reveal secrets, to impart gnosis, to explain the true nature of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. This is the function of Christ in Gnostic theology, not to die for sins, but to awaken from ignorance. Sin, in the Gnostic understanding, is not the fundamental human problem. Ignorance is, humanity has not fallen in the sense of morally corrupted by an ancestral act of disobedience requiring divine forgiveness. Humanity is asleep, forgetful, trapped in material existence and unaware of its divine origin. What is needed is not a sacrifice to appease an angry God, but a teacher to reveal the truth, a revealer who can break through the archonic deceptions and remind souls of who they truly are. Christ descends from the pleroma not by truly becoming flesh in many Gnostic texts. His incarnation is docetic, meaning he only appeared to have a physical body, but by projecting an image of himself into the material realm, a form that can be seen and heard by those with eyes to see and ears to hear. His teachings are not primarily ethical instructions, though ethics have their place. They are cosmological revelations, explanations of the structure of reality, exposures of the archonic system, and assurances that liberation is possible. In the Gospel of Truth attributed to Valentinus, Christ is described as the word that came forth from the pleroma to bring knowledge. The text emphasizes that ignorance about the Father was what gave rise to anguish, fear, and confusion. Christ comes to dispel this ignorance to reveal the Father, and thereby to dissolve the existential terror that grips those who do not know their origin or destiny. He came in the midst of them in the form of a word. He came to awaken those who sleep, and to enlighten those who are in darkness. The Gospel of Philip emphasizes the salvific power of knowledge over ritual. The truth did not come into the world naked, it says, but it came in types and images. The world will not receive it any other way. Christ brings knowledge, but he brings it in a form that can be received, in parables and symbols, in rituals that point to higher realities without being those realities themselves. The sacraments, baptism, chrism, Eucharist, are real and powerful, but their power is not magical. They are effective insofar as they mediate gnosis, insofar as they serve as occasions for awakening. Perhaps most striking is the Gospel of Judas, a text known through references by early church fathers, but actually rediscovered only in the 1970s and not published until 2006. In this Gospel, Judas is not the traitor but the hero, the one disciple who truly understands Jesus' teaching. The other disciples worship the Demiurge without knowing it, thinking they serve the true God. Judas alone recognizes the distinction, and when Jesus asks him to facilitate the crucifixion, Judas understands that this is not betrayal but liberation. By enabling the death of Jesus' material body, Judas is helping to free the spiritual Christ from the flesh, allowing him to return to the pleroma. In several texts, Jesus laughs. This is a distinctive feature of Gnostic Christology. He laughs at the archons, at their pretensions to power, at their threats and violence. In the second treatise of the Great Seth, Jesus describes his crucifixion. I did not die in reality, but in appearance, lest I be put to shame by them. I removed the shame from me, and I did not become faint-hearted in the face of what happened to me at their hands. I was about to succumb to fear, but I suffered only in their sight and thought. In order that I might destroy their error and their folly, I suffered in their sight so that they would think they had conquered me. The crucifixion in this reading is a cosmic joke played on the archons. They think they are killing God, asserting their power, proving their sovereignty. In fact, they are simply destroying an appearance, an empty shell, while the true Christ observes from beyond their reach, untouched by their violence, laughing at their ignorance. The resurrection is not a miraculous reversal of death, but the revelation that death never had power over the spiritual reality, that the archon's greatest weapon is useless against those who know. This is not to say that suffering is unreal or unimportant in Gnostic thought. The material realm is genuinely painful. Bodies suffer. People die. The archonic system causes real anguish. but from the perspective of ultimate reality, from the standpoint of the pleroma, this suffering is temporary, limited to the material realm, unable to touch or damage the divine spark. The awakened soul knows this, and can therefore endure material suffering without despair, understanding it as the temporary condition of a consciousness passing through the realm of the Demiurge on its way home. Christ's teaching is not meant for everyone. This is another controversial aspect of Gnostic theology. There are those capable of receiving gnosis, the pneumatics, the spiritual ones, and there are those who live by soul and faith, the psychics, and there are those trapped entirely in matter, the hylics. The pneumatics can be fully liberated. The psychics can achieve a lesser salvation through faith and good works. The hylics are, at least in some texts, simply unable to rise above the material realm, being so identified with body and matter that they lack even the capacity for spiritual awakening. This hierarchy is deterministic in a way that troubles modern sensibilities. It suggests that not all humans are equal in their spiritual capacity, that salvation is not universally available, that some souls are simply lost. Different Gnostic schools handled this differently. Some insisted on a strict predestination. You are pneumatic or psychic or hylic by nature, and nothing can change this. Others allowed for more fluidity, suggesting that anyone might awaken if given the right teaching at the right time. But all agreed that Christ's primary mission was to the pneumatics, to those capable of receiving full gnosis, to gather the scattered light and prepare it for the final ascent. His teachings were encoded, deliberately obscure to outsiders, clear only to those who had the capacity to understand. When his disciples asked him why he spoke in parables, he answered, "To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom, but to them it has not been given." The revealer brings dangerous knowledge. The archons recognize the threat. In various texts they attempt to stop him, to silence him, to kill him, but they fail because they do not understand what they are fighting. They can destroy the body, but they cannot touch the teaching, cannot prevent the dissemination of gnosis, cannot recapture the light that has been awakened. And so the knowledge spreads, passed from teacher to student, written in coded texts, preserved in communities of the knowing ones, maintained in secret despite the efforts of both pagan authorities and eventually Christian orthodoxy to suppress it. By the 4th century, Christianity had transformed from a persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine's conversion, the Council of Nicaea in 325, the establishment of Christian orthodoxy backed by imperial authority, these were watershed moments. What had been a diverse movement with multiple competing visions of the faith was rapidly consolidating around a single authorized version. The consolidation required both positive and negative measures. Positively, the Church had to define what it believed. The creeds, the canon of Scripture, the theological formulations that distinguished correct belief from heresy. Negatively, it had to suppress alternative versions, silence dissenting teachers, destroy texts that contradicted the emerging orthodoxy. The Gnostics were early targets. They had always been controversial, always been argued against, always been marginalized by the proto-Orthodox communities. But as long as Christianity itself was marginal, as long as there was no imperial power backing any particular version of the faith, the Gnostics could survive in their own communities, maintaining their own traditions, reading their own texts. After Constantine's survival became much more difficult. The Church now had the power to enforce orthodoxy through law, to confiscate and burn books, to exile or imprison teachers who refused to conform. The diverse landscape of early Christianity was being flattened into uniformity. The Council of Nicaea established the divinity of Christ, declaring him of one substance with the Father, eternally begotten, not made. This was directed partly against Arianism, which taught that Christ was a created being, but it also implicitly rejected various Gnostic Christologies that distinguished between the human Jesus and the divine Christ, or that portrayed Christ as an emissary from a God utterly transcendent beyond the Creator. The canon was more gradually established. Various lists of approved books circulated in different regions. Some included texts that would later be excluded, some excluded texts that would later be included, but the trend was clear toward a defined collection, limited and closed, that would serve as the sole authoritative scripture. In 367, Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, issued his festal letter. This annual letter, sent each Easter to the churches under his authority, listed the books that should be read as scripture and those that should be rejected. His list is remarkably similar to the modern New Testament canon. 4 Gospels, Acts, the Epistles of Paul, the Catholic Epistles, Revelation, noticeably absent of the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Apocryphon of John, and the numerous other texts that various Christian communities had been reading and venerating. Athanasius was explicit about what should be done with the excluded texts. Let no one add to these. Let nothing be taken away. Let the heretics have these things as their own invention. The implication was clear. The texts not on the list were not merely secondary or less authoritative. They were heretical, dangerous, to be removed from circulation. We don't know exactly how or when the Nag Hammadi codices were hidden. The most plausible scenario is that monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery, hearing that heretical texts were to be destroyed, chose to preserve them instead. Perhaps they believed the texts had value. Perhaps they simply hated the idea of burning books. Perhaps they hoped the texts might be useful for refuting heresies, and so should be preserved for that purpose. They gathered 13 codices, wrapped them in leather, sealed them into a jar, and buried them at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs. The hiding place was well chosen, dry, stable, away from human settlement. The texts would remain there, forgotten, for nearly 16 centuries. This was not an isolated event. Throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, as Christian orthodoxy consolidated, texts were destroyed, communities were disbanded, teachers were silenced. The institutional church, now possessing state power, used that power effectively. Heresy was not just wrong belief to be argued against, it was a crime to be punished. The Gnostic communities could not compete with this kind of force. They had no institutional structure comparable to the emerging Catholic Church. They were not organised hierarchically with bishops and metropolitans and patriarchs. They were loose networks of teachers and students, house churches, small communities meeting in secret or semi-secret. When the persecution came, they could not resist. They could only hide, flee, or capitulate. Many capitulated, probably, when the choice is between your beliefs and your life, between preserving your texts and protecting your family. Most people compromise. The Gnostic communities were absorbed into orthodoxy, their members conforming outwardly while perhaps preserving some of their beliefs privately, passing down fragments of teaching that would resurface in later mystical movements. Some fled, taking their teachings to remote areas, regions where the reach of the church was limited. There are hints of Gnostic or Gnostic-influenced communities surviving in Mesopotamia, in Egypt's desert, in North Africa. These communities evolved, merged with other traditions, became something other than what they had been. But they preserved elements of the original teaching, fragments that would eventually feed into Islamic mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah, medieval heretical movements. And some hid the texts, as at Nag Hammadi, hoping that a future generation might find them, might be more receptive to the message they contained, might live in a time when diversity of belief would not be punished by death. Valentinus died in Rome, his school continuing for a few generations after him, but gradually fading. Basiles and his son Isidore taught in Alexandria, their complex cosmology debated and refined, until the debates ceased and the school closed. Marcion was expelled from the church, founded his own communities stretching from Spain to Syria. But within a few centuries those communities were either reabsorbed into orthodoxy or destroyed. Mani, the prophet who combined Christian, Buddhist, and Zoroastrian elements into a new synthesis, saw his religion spread across vast territories from North Africa to China, lasting longer than the others, nearly 1,000 years, but eventually it too was hunted down, its texts burned, its last adherents martyred or converted. By the 6th century, Gnosticism as an organised movement was effectively extinct in the Mediterranean world. The texts were lost, the teachers were gone, the communities had been disbanded or absorbed. The elaborate cosmologies, the rituals of ascent, the passwords for passing the archonic gates, all of this survived only in the refutations written by the heresiologists, where they were preserved not as living tradition, but as cautionary examples of error. What caused the fall? The simple answer is power. The Orthodox Church gained political authority, and it used that authority to eliminate competitors. But this is too simple. Why did Orthodoxy win the political struggle? Why did its version of Christianity prove more adaptable to imperial patronage, more capable of creating stable institutions, more successful at attracting the masses? Part of the answer is theological. Orthodox Christianity offered a message that was, in crucial respects, more hopeful than Gnosticism. The world, however fallen, is God's creation and is good. The body, however corruptible, is part of what humans are meant to be and will be resurrected. Salvation is available to all who believe, not just to a spiritual elite capable of receiving secret knowledge. Christ died for everyone's sins, not just to reveal truth to a few. This is a message with broad appeal. It promises that the material world matters, that history is going somewhere, that God cares about justice in this realm, not just in some transcendent beyond. It offers hope to the poor, the enslaved, the suffering. Your pain is not permanent. Your current condition is not your eternal destiny. Resurrection is coming. Gnosticism, for all its intellectual sophistication, offered a message that could seem deeply pessimistic. The material world is a mistake, a prison. Your body is a tomb. Most of the people around you are incapable of salvation, trapped by nature and materiality. The powers that rule this world are hostile and cannot be defeated in political terms, only escaped from through individual gnosis. This is not a message that builds mass movements or offers hope for social transformation. Part of the answer is sociological. Orthodox Christianity developed institutional structures that could survive persecution and maintain unity across vast distances. The episcopal hierarchy, with bishops in major cities maintaining communion with each other, provided continuity and authority. The liturgical tradition, with standardized prayers and sacraments, created shared identity. The rule of faith provided a simple, memorable summary of core beliefs that could be taught to catechumens and recited by believers. Gnostic communities, in contrast, were typically small, teacher-dependent, centered around the personal authority of individual visionaries. When a teacher died or was martyred, the community might dissolve. When persecution scattered the members, there was no institutional structure to maintain connection and reconstitute the community elsewhere. The knowledge was often transmitted orally, or recorded in texts that required expert interpretation, making it difficult to preserve and transmit reliably across generations. Part of the answer is philosophical. Gnosticism incorporated sophisticated Platonic metaphysics, complex mythological narratives, and elaborate cosmological speculations. To fully understand and appreciate Gnostic teaching required significant education, leisure time for study and contemplation, and intellectual capacity. This limited its appeal to relatively elite audiences, educated urbanites, philosophical seekers, people with the resources and inclination for deep theological speculation. Orthodox Christianity certainly had its own intellectual tradition, its own theologians and philosophers, but it also worked to make its message accessible to everyone. The Gospels were written in common Greek, not literary Greek. The parables used simple, memorable images. The liturgy could be meaningful even to those who understood little of the theology. You didn't need to grasp the finer points of Christology to participate in the fish Christian community, receive the sacraments and live as a Christian, but perhaps the deepest reason for Gnosticism's fall is that it was, in a sense, parasitic on the traditions it criticized. Gnosticism defined itself against Orthodox Christianity, against Judaism, against the creator God of Genesis. It inverted the values, reinterpreted the myths, offered secret knowledge as opposed to public faith. But inversions depend on what they're inverting. Secret knowledge presupposes public teaching that it surpasses. Gnostic Christianity required Orthodox Christianity as a foil, a background against which to define itself. When orthodoxy was one option among many, Gnosticism could thrive as another option, sophisticated and attractive to certain temperaments. But when orthodoxy became dominant, backed by imperial power enforcing uniformity, Gnosticism lost the diversity that had allowed it to exist. It could not maintain itself as a pure negation. It needed the living tradition it was reinterpreting, and when that tradition hardened into enforced orthodoxy, the space for reinterpretation closed. And so the light dimmed. The knowing ones scattered, hid, were silenced. The texts were buried or burned. The cosmologies were forgotten. The passwords were lost. The elaborate systems that had made sense of suffering, explained the origin of evil, and offered paths to liberation were reduced to footnotes in heresiological treatises, warnings about dangerous thinking, examples of how far from truth the human mind could wander when it abandoned apostolic tradition. For more than 1,500 years, the Gnostic voice was effectively silent. Historians knew about the movement only through its opponents' descriptions. Theologians referenced it only as error. The texts themselves, the actual words of the Gnostic teachers, were lost, until a farmer's shovel struck clay in the Egyptian desert and the voices began to speak again. The recovery of the Nag Hammadi library was not immediate or straightforward. Muhammad Ali al-Saman found the codices in 1845, but their significance was not recognized for years. They were dispersed, sold piecemeal, some pages destroyed before scholars even knew they existed. The process of gathering the scattered fragments, translating them, publishing them, and making them available to the wider world took decades. Jean Dorès, a French Egyptologist, was one of the first scholars to examine the texts. He visited Egypt in 1847 and was shown some of the codices by a Coptic scholar who had managed to acquire one of them. Dorès immediately recognized that these were not just any early Christian texts, but evidence of the Gnostic movements that had been known only through polemical references. He photographed pages, took notes, and published preliminary reports that began to alert the scholarly world to the significance of the discovery. But much of the collection had been acquired by the Coptic Museum in Cairo, and access was restricted. Political instability in Egypt, bureaucratic obstacles, and simple academic territoriality slowed the work of translation and publication. It was not until the 1970s that a comprehensive edition of the text became available in English, edited by James Robinson and an international team of scholars. When the texts finally emerged into public consciousness, they caused sensation and controversy. Here were Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, Mary Magdalene, Judas, texts that had been lost for centuries, now readable again. Here was the Apocryphon of John, with its elaborate creation myth, casting the God of Genesis as a false creator. Here was the Gospel of Truth possibly written by Valentinus himself, one of the most brilliant early Christian thinkers. The Vatican was not pleased. These texts challenged the narrative that the Church had carefully constructed over centuries. They provided evidence that early Christianity was far more diverse than official history admitted, that there had been sophisticated alternatives to orthodoxy, that the consolidation of doctrine had involved suppression and silencing. Conservative Christians denounced the texts as heretical, their recovery as an attempt to undermine faith. But for historians of early Christianity, the Nag Hammadi library was an extraordinary gift. It allowed them to study Gnostic thought directly, rather than through the distorting lens of heresiological refutation. They could now compare what Irenaeus said the Gnostics believed with what the Gnostics actually wrote, and they found that while Irenaeus was generally accurate in his quotations, his interpretation and framing were deeply hostile and often misleading. Elaine Pagels, professor at Princeton University, became one of the most prominent interpreters of the Gnostic text for a general audience. Her book The Gnostic Gospels, published in 1979, won both the National Book Critics Circle Award and the National Book Award. She argued that the struggle between Gnosticism and orthodoxy was not primarily about theology, but about authority, about who would control the emerging church and what kind of institution it would become. The Gnostics, Pagels suggested, represented a more charismatic, individualistic, egalitarian form of Christianity. They emphasized direct personal experience of the divine over institutional mediation. They allowed women to serve as teachers and prophets. They valued knowledge over obedience. This made them threatening to those who were trying to build a hierarchical, male-dominated church with bishops wielding authority over doctrine and practice. The Orthodox victory in this reading was not truth triumphing over error, but one form of Christianity defeating another. The institutional over the charismatic, the hierarchical over the egalitarian, the male-dominated over the more gender-inclusive. The texts that were buried at Nag Hammadi represented not heresies that deserved to be suppressed, but viable alternatives that were eliminated for political rather than theological reasons. This interpretation was controversial. Many scholars argued that Pagels overstated the case, that the theological differences between Gnosticism and orthodoxy were real and significant, that the Gnostic emphasis on secret knowledge and spiritual elitism was its own kind of hierarchy, that women may have had prominent roles in some Gnostic communities but not in others. The debate continues. What is undeniable is that the Nag Hammadi texts transformed the scholarly understanding of early Christianity. They provided primary sources, where before there had been only secondary reports. They revealed the sophistication and diversity of Gnostic thought. They challenged simplistic narratives about early Christian unity. They opened up new questions about how and why certain versions of Christianity succeeded while others failed. But the texts also began to resonate beyond academic circles. In the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, with its suspicion of authority, its interest in alternative spiritualities, its fascination with mysticism and direct experience of the divine, Gnosticism found a receptive audience. Here was an ancient tradition that questioned the goodness of the material world, that saw institutional religion as oppressive, that valued individual gnosis over collective dogma. It was, or could be made to seem, remarkably contemporary. Carl Jung had been interested in Gnosticism since early in his career, but it was not until after the Nag Hammadi discovery that he could study actual Gnostic texts in detail. He saw in Gnostic mythology a symbolic representation of psychological processes, archetypes of the unconscious projected onto the cosmic screen. The Demiurge, in Jung's reading, represents the ego, the conscious self that believes itself to be the whole of what we are, that thinks it is in control, that proclaims, "I am God, and there is no other beside me," when in fact it is a relatively small part of the psyche, ignorant of the deeper unconscious from which it emerged. The ego constructs a world, our experienced reality, but this world is shaped by the ego's limitations, its blindness to the unconscious, its inability to recognize forces it does not understand. Sophia represents the anima, the soul, the connecting principle between ego and self. Her fall is the descent of consciousness into matter, into identified with the ego, forgetting its deeper ground. Her longing to return home is the psyche's drive toward wholeness, toward the integration of conscious and unconscious, toward what Jung called individuation. The pleroma is the self in Jung's terminology, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, persona and anima, all integrated into a whole that transcends any of its parts. The journey of the soul through the archonic realms back to the pleroma is the psychological process of recognizing and integrating the unconscious, dissolving the ego's pretension to sovereignty, and achieving a more complete and balanced sense of identity. In this psychological reading, gnosis is not knowledge of cosmological facts, but self-knowledge, the recognition of one's true nature as more than ego, as connected to depths and heights that the ego alone cannot access. The awakening that the Gnostics describe is the awakening from identification with the ego self to recognition of the larger self. Jung's interpretation was influential but also controversial. Critics argued that he was reducing theology to psychology, treating ancient religious movements as if they were merely projecting interior psychological dynamics onto external reality. The Gnostics believed they were describing actual cosmic realities, actual divine beings, an actual transcendent God. To treat all of this as symbolic of psychological processes was to fundamentally misunderstand their intent. But Jung's defenders argued that symbol and reality are not simply opposed, that psychological archetypes have their own kind of reality, that the question of whether the Gnostic cosmology is literally true in some objective sense is less important than whether it effectively describes human experience, whether it provides a framework for understanding consciousness and its relationship to larger realities. Philip K. Dick took Gnostic ideas in a different direction. The science fiction writer had an intense series of visionary experiences in 1974, which he spent the rest of his life trying to understand. He filled thousands of pages of journals, what he called his exegesis, analysing and reanalysing what had happened to him, drawing on Gnosticism, Christianity, philosophy, quantum mechanics, and his own wild imagination. Came to believe that the world we experience is not real, that what we take to be in 70s California is actually Rome in the 1st century, that we are trapped in a black iron prison created by the Demiurge, that time stopped when Christ died and has been repeating the same events over and over. This sounds insane, and Dick himself often questioned his sanity. But underneath the bizarre formulations, he was grappling with genuine Gnostic themes. The illusory nature of reality, the possibility that the world is controlled by malevolent forces, the hope that true reality might break through and liberate us from our prison. His novel Valis, Vast Active Living Intelligence System, is the most direct fictional expression of these ideas, depicting a character named Horselover Fat, a thin disguise for Dick himself, who has mystical experiences and becomes convinced that a satellite of divine origin is beaming information into his brain, awakening him to the truth about reality. The novel is strange, often intentionally unclear about what is real and what is delusion, but it captures something essential about the Gnostic sensibility. The conviction that everything is not what it seems, that we are imprisoned in a false reality, that awakening is possible but difficult and disorienting. Dick's work has been enormously influential on subsequent science fiction and popular culture. Films like The Matrix draw directly on Gnostic themes. The world as illusion and reality as prison, awakening as liberation, hidden forces controlling what people perceive and believe. Neo's the pneumatic, the one capable of gnosis. Morpheus is the revealer, offering the choice between comfortable illusion and difficult truth. The Matrix itself is the material cosmos, the constructed reality that feels real but is actually a kind of simulation. The connection between Gnosticism and simulation theory is not accidental. Both involve the claim that reality is not what it appears to be, that we are embedded in a constructed world, that there is a more fundamental level of reality beyond or outside what we directly experience. Both suggest that awakening to this truth is possible but difficult, requiring a break with consensus reality and accepted beliefs. Contemporary simulation hypothesis, as proposed by philosopher Nick Bostrom and taken seriously by some physicists and computer scientists, argues that if it is possible to create conscious beings within computer simulations, and if such simulations can create their own nested simulations, then statistically speaking, we are more likely to be living in a simulation than in base reality. This is a technical argument based on probability theory, but its existential implications are remarkably similar to Gnostic cosmology. We may be living in a constructed world, created by beings of greater power, who are themselves perhaps created by beings of still greater power, in a hierarchy stretching upwards towards something we cannot directly access. The Demiurge in this reading is the programmer or the system itself, powerful within its domain but limited by the hardware and software of the simulation, unable to access or even comprehend the reality outside the computational framework. The glitches and paradoxes that some physicists point to as evidence of simulation The strange behavior of quantum mechanics, the fine-tuning of physical constants, the mathematical structure of natural law are like the inconsistencies in the Demiurge's creation, hints that reality is constructed rather than fundamental. Whether this is a useful way to think about Gnosticism, or whether it is a category error projecting modern concerns onto ancient texts, is debatable. But it demonstrates that the Gnostic questions remain alive. Is reality fundamentally trustworthy? Or might it be a prison? Are the forces that govern the world benevolent, or might they be ignorant or hostile? Is awakening possible, and if so, what does it entail? The 21st century has produced its own versions of the archons, its own machinery of control, its own reasons to suspect that the world is not entirely what it seems. We live in an age of unprecedented surveillance, where every action leaves digital traces, where algorithms predict and shape behavior, where the boundary between person and data profile grows increasingly blurred. The archons governed through the celestial spheres, imposing their influence through the movement of planets. We are governed through networks, influenced by recommendation algorithms shaped by the architecture of platforms designed to capture and hold attention. The mechanism is different, but the principle is similar. Forces that operate mostly invisibly, that know more about us than we know about ourselves, that predict and nudge and constrain in ways we do not fully recognize or understand. The ancient Gnostic worried about fate. Hymermene, the inexorable chain of causation that determines events in advance. The modern person worries about filter bubbles, algorithmic amplification, the invisible hand of machine, learning, shaping what information reaches consciousness, what choices seem available, what futures appear possible. Both express the anxiety of living in a world where forces beyond our control and often beyond our awareness are shaping the conditions of our existence. The Gnostic critiqued the law as the Demiurge's instrument of control. We might critique consumer capitalism as a system that shapes desire, manufactures needs, and keeps people trapped in cycles of work and consumption, always striving but never satisfied, always pursuing happiness through material acquisition in a way that benefits the system more than the individual. The products we buy, the brands we follow, the lifestyles we aspire to, all of this is constructed, designed, optimized to keep us engaged and consuming. The Demiurge proclaimed himself God because he knew no other. The systems we inhabit present themselves as natural, inevitable, the only possible way to organize society. Alternative ways of living become difficult to imagine, not because they are impossible, but because the dominant order has so thoroughly colonized consciousness that questioning it feels impossible. This is what the Marxists called false consciousness, and what the Gnostics called ignorance, the condition of accepting the prison as reality, the constructed as natural, the limited as total. But there are also crucial disanalogies. The Gnostic cosmos was fixed, eternal, metaphysical. The systems of modernity are historical, contingent, changeable. The archons were cosmic powers beyond human capacity to challenge. Algorithms and corporations and political structures are human creations, however opaque and complex, and can in principle be understood, resisted, reformed, or replaced. The Gnostic response to the archonic world was primarily individual. Acquire gnosis, withdraw from entanglement with matter, prepare your soul for escape. The modern response to systems of control can be collective. Organize, resist, create alternative institutions, imagine and work towards different futures. The prison is real, but unlike the metaphysical prison of ancient cosmology, this one has human architects and can be dismantled by human hands. Still, the parallels are striking enough to make Gnostic texts feel surprisingly contemporary. When we read about the archons controlling human consciousness through invisible influences, we think of surveillance capitalism. When we read about the Demiurge proclaiming himself God while remaining ignorant of higher realities, we think of ideologies that present themselves as total explanations while remaining blind to their own assumptions and limitations. When we read about souls trapped in material existence, cycling through incarnation, forgetting their origin, We think of lives trapped in the daily grind, cycling through work and consumption, forgetting or never discovering what might give life genuine meaning. The question the Gnostics asked remains pertinent. How do we know what is real? In an age of deep fakes, misinformation, virtual reality, and competing narratives about every significant issue, the question of what can be trusted as true is urgent. The Gnostic answer: trust your direct gnosis, your experiential knowledge of the divine, your awareness of the light within, has a certain appeal but also obvious dangers. How do we distinguish genuine insight from delusion, authentic awakening from ideological capture? The Gnostics did not have good mechanisms for this. Different teachers made contradictory claims, all based on alleged revelation. The proliferation of Gnostic schools, each with its own cosmology, suggests the difficulty of adjudicating between competing Gnostic claims. The Orthodox emphasis on tradition, scripture, and communal discernment had its own problems. It could indeed lead to suppression of genuine insight, but it at least provided mechanisms for distinguishing between vision and madness. Perhaps the deeper lesson is that both are needed: the Gnostic insistence that direct experience matters, that authority should not simply be accepted uncritically, that awakening to truth requires personal transformation, and the Orthodox insistence that individual experience needs to be tested against tradition, that community matters, that not every claim to special knowledge is valid. We live between the pleroma and the material realm, between gnosis and ignorance, between liberation and imprisonment. The systems that govern us are neither fully under our control nor absolutely determinative of our existence. We have agency, but it's limited. We have knowledge, but it's partial. We can imagine alternatives, but actualizing them is difficult. The Gnostic texts do not provide answers to these modern dilemmas. They were addressing their own time, their own questions, their own experience of imprisonment and longing for liberation. But they remind us that human beings have been grappling with these questions for millennia, that the sense of being trapped in systems not of our making is ancient, that the hope for awakening and liberation is perennial. In recent decades, Sophia has become a figure of particular interest to feminist theologians, eco-spiritualists, and those seeking to balance masculine and feminine principles in religious thought. She represents divine wisdom, creative power, the feminine aspect of God that was suppressed or marginalized in patriarchal monotheism. The Christian tradition preserved Sophia in a limited way. The Hagia, Sophia, the holy wisdom, churches dedicated to her, theological reflection on divine wisdom, but she remained abstract, domesticated, safely subordinated to the masculine God the Father and his masculine Son. The Gnostic Sophia is wilder, more dangerous, more powerful. She creates without permission. She falls from heaven. She gives birth to the Demiurge. She works from her exile to undermine the false creation. She is active, not merely contemplative, passionate, not merely intellectual, tragically flawed, not simply perfect. For feminist theology, Sophia provides an image of the divine feminine that is not merely the passive partner or the nurturing mother, but an active agent, a creator, a force to be reckoned with. Her fall can be read as the suppression of the feminine in theological thought. The patriarchal traditions cast the feminine principle as the source of error, the origin of material entanglement, the reason for cosmic tragedy. But Sophia is also the one who works to rectify the mistake, who aids humanity against the Demiurge, who ensures that the divine spark enters creation. She is both problem and solution, both the source of the fall and the agent of redemption. Some contemporary thinkers reinterpret Sophia's story as a myth about the necessity of error for growth, the value of experience even when painful, the creative potential of what patriarchal systems label as mistake or sin. Sophia's desire to create alone without her consort can be read not as transgression but as autonomy, the assertion of independent agency. Her fall is then not punishment but consequence, not moral failure but the inevitable result of venturing beyond established boundaries. In eco-spiritual movements, Sophia becomes associated with the earth itself, with Gaia, with the living planet that humans have damaged and exploited. The Demiurge's material creation, which traps spirit in matter, mirrors the industrial civilization that extracts and commodifies nature, treating the living world as mere resource. Sophia's exile and her work to liberate the trapped light becomes the Earth's silent resistance, the natural world's persistent vitality despite human destruction, the possibility of healing and restoration. These interpretations move far from the original Gnostic texts, which generally portrayed matter as inherently problematic, and the material world as a prison to escape from rather than a home to heal and restore. The ancient Gnostics were not environmentalists. They did not celebrate the body or nature. Their hope was liberation from the physical realm, not its redemption. But symbols evolve. Traditions are reinterpreted. The figure of Sophia proves flexible enough to carry meanings her original devotees might not have recognized or approved. What remains constant across these various appropriations is the sense that Sophia represents something suppressed, marginalized, diminished by dominant religious traditions, and that recovering her means recovering aspects of the sacred that have been lost. In some contemporary pagan and goddess movements, Sophia merges with or is identified with other female divine figures. Isis, Inanna, Astarte, the Great Mother. She becomes part of a larger project of recovering pre-patriarchal or non-patriarchal forms of spirituality, ways of relating to the divine that do not assume masculine sovereignty, that value the earth and the body, that locate the sacred in embodied experience rather than transcendent abstraction. Orthodox Christianity has its own resources for divine wisdom, the figure of Lady Wisdom in Proverbs and the Wisdom of Solomon, the Logos theology that influenced the Gospel of John, the mystical traditions that speak of God Sophia. But these traditions have generally kept wisdom safely subordinated to the masculine trinity, have avoided the dangerous implications of a fully divine feminine principle, equal to or even preceding the Father. The Gnostic Sophia is not safe. She disrupts cosmic order. She creates catastrophe. She is passionate, impulsive, tragic. She is more like the Greek goddesses, powerful, complex, capable of both creation and destruction, than like the carefully domesticated feminine virtues that patriarchal religion allows. Whether this Sophia can be recovered, whether she should be recovered, whether modern reinterpretations honour or distort the ancient texts, these questions remain contested. But her return in whatever form suggests that the questions she embodies about creative power, about the relationship between spirit and matter, about the value and danger of transgressing boundaries, about the need to balance masculine and feminine principles, remain vital. The most disturbing implication of Gnostic theology is that the Demiurge is not simply an external force, not merely a cosmic tyrant to be escaped, but a possibility within consciousness itself. The condition of being powerful yet ignorant, of constructing a world while remaining blind to its limitations, of proclaiming sovereignty while actually operating within constraints one does not recognize, this is not unique to archaic deities. It is a permanent human temptation. Every ideology that presents itself as total truth, every system that claims to explain everything, every leader who declares absolute authority, every movement that silences dissent in the name of orthodoxy. All of these exhibit something of the Demiurge's character. They create order, impose structure, demand obedience, and punish those who question. They claim to represent ultimate reality when they actually represent a limited perspective, a partial understanding, a construction that mistakes itself for the foundation. At the individual level, the Demiurge represents the ego's tendency to imagine itself as the whole, to construct a self-concept and defend it against all challenges, to organize experience around maintaining a coherent narrative, even when that narrative excludes uncomfortable truths. We all do this. We all create a world that makes sense from our limited perspective, that confirms our assumptions, that protects our sense of identity, and when something threatens that constructed world, We react with the Demiurge's rage. I am God, and there is no other beside me. The Gnostic critique is uncomfortable because it applies not just to others, to the false gods they worship, the systems they uncritically accept, but to ourselves, to our own tendency to construct meaning and then mistake our construction for reality. The line between necessary order and oppressive control, between legitimate authority and tyrannical arrogance, between confidence and blind certainty is not always clear. Elaine Pagels points out that the Gnostic texts themselves could be oppressive, that the claim to possess special knowledge not available to others creates its own hierarchy, its own form of exclusion. The pneumatic who has gnosis looks down on the psychic who has only faith and the hylic who is trapped in matter. This is a different kind of elitism than Orthodox Christian clergy exercising institutional authority, but it is elitism nonetheless. The Gnostic answer to the Demiurge's blindness is knowledge, gnosis, awakening. But how do we know when we have truly awakened and are not simply exchanging one construction for another, one limited perspective for a different limited perspective? The Gnostic who recognizes the Demiurge's blindness may still be blind to other aspects of reality, may still mistake his own vision for total truth. This is why the image of the Demiurge remains powerful, not as a specific theological claim about the creator of the universe, but as a permanent warning about the human condition. We are all, to some extent, blind gods, creating worlds we take to be real, exercising power we take to be legitimate, claiming knowledge we take to be complete, while remaining necessarily limited by our perspective, our history, our embodiment. The way beyond this is not to claim perfect gnosis, not to assert that we have finally achieved complete awakening and can now see reality as it truly is. That claim itself would be the Demiurge speaking. The way beyond is humility, the recognition that all human knowledge is partial, all human power is limited, all human constructions are provisional. But this humility must be balanced against another truth. Some knowledge is better than ignorance, some power is used more justly than other power. Some constructions are closer to reality than others. The Gnostic insight that reality is not what it appears, that systems of control masquerade as natural order, that awakening is possible, this insight is valuable even if gnosis itself can become another form of blindness. Kurt Rudolph, the German scholar of Gnosticism, emphasized that Gnostic thought should not be romanticized or uncritically celebrated. It contained its own violence, its own exclusions, its own tendencies toward dogmatism and sectarianism. The Gnostics fought bitterly among themselves, each school claiming to possess the true gnosis, each teacher dismissing others as misguided or fraudulent. The diversity that modern readers admire in Gnostic thought was experienced by the Gnostics themselves as fragmentation, confusion, the difficulty of knowing whom to trust. Yet Rudolph also insisted that Gnostic texts should be studied seriously, not merely as historical curiosities, but as profound attempts to grapple with perennial human questions. Why is there suffering? Why does the world contain evil? What is the relationship between spirit and matter? How can individuals find meaning in a cosmos that seems indifferent or hostile to human flourishing? The Demiurge, as the Gnostics understood him, is the answer to the problem of evil. If the Creator is all-powerful and all-good, why is the world so full of suffering? Orthodox theology developed various responses: free will, the greater good, the mysterious purposes of God, the temporary nature of suffering compared to eternal salvation. These answers satisfy some people, but leave others unconvinced. The Gnostic answer is simpler and more disturbing. The Creator is not all good. The world contains suffering because its architect is ignorant, because creation is flawed at its foundation, because the material realm is inherently problematic. This solves the logical problem. There is no need to reconcile omnipotence with benevolence if the Creator lacks benevolence. But it creates a new problem. How do we relate to such a Creator? Not with worship, certainly. Perhaps with pity, perhaps with defiance, perhaps simply with the determination to escape his domain. The desert wind moves across the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, carrying sand that slowly covers and uncovers the layers of history. Somewhere beneath the red rock, invisible from any current vantage point, lies the spot where 13 codices were buried in the 4th century and found again in the 20th. The location is not marked. There is no monument. The jar that contained the text was shattered in 1945 and long since discarded. But the texts remain. They sit in museums and libraries, photographed, digitized, translated into dozens of languages, available now to anyone with internet access. The words that were preserved in secret, that could be read only by those who possessed the physical manuscripts or travelled to see them, are now globally distributed, floating in the cloud, accessible to millions. What would the monks who hid the codices think of this? Perhaps they would be pleased that their act of preservation succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined, that the texts they saved from destruction have reached an audience vastly larger than the small communities that originally treasured them. Or perhaps they would be troubled that the secrets are now public, that Gnosis has been commodified into best-selling books and Hollywood films, that what was meant for the few capable of receiving it has been broadcast to all. The democratization of knowledge always carries this tension. When esoteric teachings become exoteric, when mysteries are explained in popular books, when symbols are reduced to easily digestible meanings, something is lost. The transformative power of Gnosis depends partly on the work of seeking it, the difficulty of the journey, the personal struggle to understand when everything is available immediately, when complex ideas are summarized in listicles, when depth is sacrificed to accessibility. The knowledge becomes information, useful perhaps, but no longer salvific. Yet the alternative, keeping knowledge restricted to an elite, maintaining artificial barriers to access, insisting that only the initiated can understand, has its own profound problems. It creates hierarchies of knowing and not knowing. It gives power to gatekeepers. It assumes that most people are incapable of handling difficult truths. This was the Gnostic temptation, to divide humanity into spiritual categories, to claim special access to truth, to look down on those trapped in ignorance. Perhaps the way forward is to maintain the distinction between information and gnosis, while removing artificial barriers to access. The text can be available to all, but that does not mean all will understand them in the same way, or receive the same thing from them. Gnosis, in its deepest sense, cannot be transmitted through texts alone. It requires something more: contemplation, practice, perhaps community, certainly time. The Nag Hammadi texts are now part of the historical record, contributing to our understanding of early Christianity, illuminating a lost world of diverse belief and practice. This is their scholarly value, and it is considerable. But for some readers, they are more than historical documents. They are living texts, capable still of provoking awakening, of challenging comfortable assumptions, of opening possibilities for experiencing reality differently. The question the texts pose, what if the God who made the world is not the true God, cannot be answered simply by historical research or theological argument. It is an existential question, a question about trust and meaning and the fundamental nature of reality. Different people will answer it differently, based on their experience, their reasoning, their temperament, their needs. For some, the question is liberating. It validates their sense that something is wrong with conventional religion, that the world's suffering cannot be reconciled with a benevolent creator, that truth must be sought beyond the boundaries of orthodoxy. The Gnostic texts give them a language for articulating doubts they may have felt but struggled to express. A tradition that takes seriously the darkness of the world without resorting to platitudes about divine plans and mysterious purposes. For others, the question is dangerous. It leads toward nihilism, toward the rejection of any order or authority, toward a radical subjectivism where everyone's gnosis is equally valid and no claims can be adjudicated. If the creator is false, if institutions are suspect, if tradition is oppressive, what is left to guide us? How do we distinguish between liberation and mere license, between awakening and solipsism? The Gnostic texts do not resolve this tension. They embody it. They are products of their time, marked by ancient cosmologies and cultural assumptions that we do not share. They are also timeless in their interrogation of power, their suspicion of appearances, their insistence that reality is more than what meets the eye. In the early 21st century, we find ourselves in a situation surprisingly parallel to the early centuries of the Common Era. We live in a time of religious and philosophical diversity, when multiple worldviews compete for adherence, when the boundaries of orthodoxy are contested or dissolved, when individuals construct their own spiritual paths from elements drawn from many traditions. We live in a time of imperial power and resistance to it, of systems that claim inevitability and movements that challenge them, of surveillance and control and the struggle for autonomy. The Gnostic texts speak to this moment not because they provide answers. They are too ancient, too alien, too marked by assumptions we no longer share to serve as simple guides. They speak to this moment because they remind us that the questions are old, that others have walked this path before, that the struggle between awakening and forgetfulness, between liberation and control, between gnosis and ignorance is perennial. The light the Gnostics spoke of, the divine spark within each person, the fragment of the pleroma trapped in matter, the consciousness that is not created by the Demiurge, but only imprisoned by him. This light they claimed could never be extinguished. It could be forgotten, covered over, dimmed by layers of material existence and archonic deception. But it remained, waiting to be recognized, ready to flare into awakening when the conditions were right. Whether this is metaphysics or metaphor, objective truth or psychological projection, cosmic fact or useful fiction, perhaps that question itself is less important than the question of what difference it makes. If believing in the inextinguishable light within yourself and others changes how you live, makes you more resistant to oppressive systems, more able to recognize truth, more capable of helping others awaken, then perhaps it is true in the sense that matters most. The clay jar that Muhammad Ali smashed open in 1945 is long gone. The codices it contained are preserved now in climate-controlled environments, handled with gloves, protected behind glass. But the knowledge they carry moves freely, replicated infinitely, translated and interpreted, appropriated and contested, living still in a way the text creators could not have anticipated. Perhaps this is the final irony. The Gnostics wrote about transcending the material world, about escaping the body and returning to pure spirit, about the superiority of the invisible over the visible. But their words survive only because they were written on physical papyrus, buried in material clay, preserved by the dry matter of the Egyptian desert. The spirit needed matter after all, needed embodiment, needed the very materiality the texts taught should be transcended. Or perhaps there is no irony, perhaps the Gnostics understood better than we give them credit for that spirit and matter are not simply opposed, that the divine spark requires a vessel, that knowledge must take form to be transmitted, that even the highest truth must descend into the material realm if it is to reach those who need it. The sun sets over the Nile Valley, the same sun that set when the codices were hidden, the same sun that the archons ruled, the same sun that the pneumatics claim to transcend. Light and shadow play across the cliffs, revealing textures and concealing depths, creating an ever-changing display of appearance that points beyond itself to something that cannot be directly seen. In monasteries and universities, in living rooms and cafes, in online forums and meditation centers, people read the texts that were buried for silence and found for speech. Some read them as history, some as philosophy, some as scripture, some as poetry, and some read them and are unmoved. Some read them and are troubled. Some read them and feel a shock of recognition, as if remembering something forgotten, as if hearing a voice that speaks to the deepest part of themselves, the part that has always suspected that the world is not what it seems, that has always longed for something beyond the material realm, that has always believed, however faintly, however uncertainly, that there is light within the darkness, waiting to be recognized. Perhaps the Gnostics were never silenced, only buried, waiting for an age when illusion ruled again, when the machinery of control had grown so sophisticated that people would be ready to hear the ancient message. You are not what they tell you you are. You are not merely what you seem to be. There is something in you that no power can fully control, no system can completely contain, no authority can finally define. Their heresy was never about rejecting God. It was about distinguishing between false gods and true, between the powers that demand obedience and the power that grants freedom, between the Creator who imprisons and the Source that liberates. The question remains open. The invitation stands. The light, they said, is hidden but not extinguished, buried but not destroyed, forgotten but not lost, waiting to be remembered, waiting to awaken, waiting for eyes to see.